Thank you guys so much. In terms of training and kind of building capabilities in behavioral science, do come back tomorrow. We have 2 roundtables talking about training. I see my colleague Etienne. He would not be happy with me if I didn't mention our roundtable about training, and he'll talk to you about some of the training that we do at BVA. It is time to move on. We have covered diversity and inclusion. We've covered employee engagement. Our next topic, perhaps the most important, because without that, I don't know if we can face the other challenges, is about sustainability and protecting our planet, and how do we drive behaviors that do that. This will be a 35-minute conversation between my colleague Bertrand Bacula, who's our Vice President at BVA Nudge Consulting here in France. Eric will be there as well, with Professor and author Wendy Wood. So stay tuned and we'll cover sustainability. We'll see you in 35 minutes.
Hi everyone, I am honored to introduce our guest speaker for the sustainability session at the Human Advantage Conference. Now, Bertrand Bacula, who is Associate Director at BVA Nudge Consulting and one of the BVA Group champions regarding sustainability, and myself will be speaking with Professor Wendy Wood. Wendy is a world leader in behavioral science. She has devoted the last 30 years to understanding how habits work. She is currently the Provost Professor of Psychology and Business at the University of Southern California and the author of a wonderful best-selling book, Good Habits, Bad Habits, The Science of Making Positive Changes That Stick, which was published in 2019, I think. Welcome, Wendy, at the Human Advantage Conference, and welcome, Bertrand.
Okay, so first of all, I would like to have your perspective on something that is quite curious to me. I think we all want to save the planet. So the intention is there, but often we don't adopt the relevant behaviors to reach this objective. Why is it so difficult for human beings to align intent and action? Why is willpower not enough to create positive habits?
That's a great question, because we all think it should be, right? If we're motivated and if we understand what we're supposed to do, then we assume that our behavior will just follow. But particularly with sustainability, we've seen that it doesn't happen that way. So right now, according to a recent Pew poll, about 80% of people in developed economies are willing to change their behavior. They say they want to change their behavior to address climate change. But we don't see much of that going on. And I mean, there are many examples of this. So there was that wonderful movie that Al Gore put together,
Yes.
An Inconvenient Truth, that actually contributed to him winning a Nobel Prize. And many people watched it. And after they watched it, the general consensus was people would say, I'm going to change my behavior. But when researchers followed them, a month later, 2 months later, nothing. Had no effect. So we're seeing this big gap between what people want and understand and what they're doing. And that is actually understandable from the perspective of habits. Mm-hmm. Habits are what's important here. It's not enough to act in a sustainable way once or twice or even for a week. In order for us to really make a difference with the environment, we're going to have to change our habits and do these sustainable things repeatedly. And habits as a memory system are not connected. They're not closely connected to our thoughts and our feelings. So we understand our thoughts and feelings really well, right? We know what our beliefs are. We know what our politics are. We're concerned about the environment. But our behavior, our habitual behavior, is part of a neural system, a neural network that isn't connected to those parts of our brain. They're somewhat separate but interconnected neural systems. And that's why psychologists tell us, as researchers have found, that people can believe one thing very strongly and be concerned about the environment and not change their behavior. So it takes a very different strategy than the one that we're used to thinking about with behavior change in order to change habits. Habits don't change by us getting motivated, us deciding to exert control over our behavior. And that's because habits are part of this separate neural system, but it's also part of the way habit memories form. So habit memories form slowly, incrementally, over time. You don't form a habit the first time you do something. It takes a lot of repetition. And they don't decay very quickly either. So your self-control, your decision to change your behavior won't last as long as your habits. When we have habits to drive, to eat meat, to use single-use plastics, to take showers for 20 minutes, not to conserve water, those habits stick around long after we've gotten tired of trying to control them. And this is, most of the time, this is a good thing. Habits are not bad. Habits really help us get through the day without having to think too much about what we're doing. We can just repeat whatever we did in the past that worked for us, and that's great. But it's when we come to change, when we come to having to alter our behavior, like in the current climate crisis, that's when habits become a liability. Our habit memory keeps us using those single-use plastic bottles. It's just easier. We don't have to think about it. It's just what we do naturally. And we're all doing so many things in our lives. For most of us, climate change is not number one all of the time. So even if our willpower wasn't enough, we wouldn't remember. We're thinking about other things, trying to achieve other goals in our lives.
Yes, that's so true. You were talking about our neural system. Do you have in mind some specific cognitive biases which could explain why we don't act as much as we should do to contribute to save the planet?
Yeah. So it's not a specific bias. It's more how habits work. Because our habits are really a reflection of the context in which we live. We think we're making decisions. We think we're acting on our goals. But once you start studying habits and understanding how they work, you realize how much of what we do is really driven by the context that we live in. So people repeat into habits what's easiest and what's most rewarding in a given environment. And once you form a habit, it starts to seem like, well, that's the normal thing to do. That's what's right. That's the regular response in this context. So habits are a function of our environments, what we repeat in our environments. But once we form them, they start to take on a life of their own. They seem right and reasonable to us. I mean, it's why in Los Angeles, where I lived for a long time, the climate is the perfect place for bike riding. But nobody does that. Everyone drives a car. Amsterdam, which is a terrible climate for bike riding. Everyone rides a bike. And you talk to people in those two locations, and they're like, of course we do, right? All Angelenos drive. That's just what you do here. It's the right thing to do. It's what they practiced, and it's what's become habitual. So it seems right. And that helps perpetuate existing habits even further. So in order to change behavior, you have to not focus on people's goals or people's understanding. You want to change habitual behavior by focusing on the habit itself. And a direct way to do that is to change the performance context.
Okay.
So change the structure of the environment. It's not a matter of individual people being selfish, being short-sighted, not being concerned enough about others. I mean, there certainly are a few of those people out there, but that's not what the problem is here. The problem is that the structures we have built and the environments that we live in are not helping us form sustainable habits. And that's what habit research has shown. You can change habits by changing the environment. You don't change habits by changing people's beliefs. For most of us, that won't work.
Okay. And do you have some examples of context change that will favorize people good habits?
Yes, definitely. I actually have been doing some work with the Paper and Packaging Board, the U.S. Paper and Packaging Board, on recycling programs to try to understand why it is that some people are able to recycle and do so regularly, and other people just don't seem to do it at all. And it turns out that there are a couple of little hacks, little tricks that people who recycle regularly do. And it has to do with their environment. So they've set up their households so that there are recycling bins in every room where they generate trash, in their office, in their kitchen. They're not keeping them out in the garage. They have them available so they are easy to use. And they also have stickers. They're likely to have stickers up indicating what is recyclable and what isn't. So for everybody in the household, it's really easy. And this is the key, we think, to changing behavior on a broad scale, is helping people understand how to make desired behaviors easier to repeat into habits, and how to make ones that maybe aren't working so much for the environment, how to change them, how to alter them so people find them a little bit more difficult. Not that they can't do them, but just a little bit more difficult so that they're less likely to repeat them into habits. And I have my own story on this. I just moved from LA, but we lived in several areas in LA. And the last time we moved, I insisted that we move right by a train station. And I didn't buy a car, which is a very weird thing to do in LA, because I knew that if I had a car, it would be too easy to get into it and just drive, even if the train station is there. But with a train station there, making it easy to take the train, and not owning a car, I lived a very non-LA lifestyle, and it was really fun because I got to walk and enjoy the beautiful weather. And I was using the train to get around. Not everybody has that kind of flexibility, obviously, but for me, it worked. There are things we can do in our own lives to make desired behaviors easier. We call it reducing friction on the behavior. And friction can be the time it takes to do something, how difficult a behavior is, or how effortful and thoughtful you have to be in order to engage in the behavior. Friction can be all of those things. You can, there are many ways, many ways to think about friction. What will work for you may not work for me, and vice versa. So if you want to eat more vegetables, have a more vegetable-based diet. I did for a while, and what I found was that when I was buying raw vegetables that needed to be cooked and washed, and I didn't do such a good job with them. But when I got them already partially cooked or washed or cut up, I was much more likely to use them because there was less friction. And in fact, we did a survey with Produce for Better Health Foundation, asking people who consumed a lot of fruits and vegetables, who had a vegetable-based diet, which is good for the environment, what they were doing to make that possible. And that was a hack that they used as well, is they reduced the friction on preparation, on food preparation, so that they found it easier to stick to a vegetable diet, and they didn't find themselves going out and eating hamburgers and other sorts of things because they had easy stuff at home. So that thing about reducing friction is really important and something that we can implement in our own lives to change our habits and live a more sustainable lifestyle.
Mm-hmm. So it means it's about the famous "Make It Easy" from Richard Taylor. If you want to encourage people to adopt a new positive habit, reduce friction and also make it easy for him or her to do the right thing. So reducing habits, making it easy. But you also mentioned for your case, you decided not to buy a car. So it means that for some key decision, they could have an important long-term effect when you make this good decision first. So maybe we could nudge people when they make such big decision to help them after to adopt new positive eco-friendly habits.
Yes, and that's a really important insight, I think, because much of the friction that we can control, you really have to do that ahead of time, right? If you're in that situation where you're trying to decide, am I going to take the bus? Am I going to drive a car? You're lost, right? Mm-hmm. You've lost that decision because your habit's going to take over and you're just going to keep doing what you've done in the past. So much of this reducing friction requires being at the grocery store, buying fruits and vegetables that are already cut up, deciding you don't want to own a car, putting out the recycling containers in the rooms where you need them. All of these things require advanced thought to restructure our environments, our local environments, our local living context, to make some behaviors easier and others more difficult.
Okay. You were talking more about our everyday behaviors, but if we look at private organization, according to you, what companies could do or must do to help their clients to adopt new eco-friendly habits and to help their employees to adopt also positive habits for the environment?
That's an even easier task because organizations make decisions all the time about how to organize and structure the work environment and the opportunities that are available to organizational members. And they can be structured in just this way so that people will find it a little bit more difficult to act in unsustainable ways than to act in sustainable ways. And one of my favorite, I think I've told you this before, Eric, but this is one of my favorite studies of all times. It was done in the 1980s, and it was a study that was designed to get people to use the elevator less in an office building. And the reason I like this study so much is because they did just what we would do in trying to change our behavior. They started off by trying to convince people. So they put signs up all over. Take the stairs, not the elevator. It's good for your health. It burns calories. Don't take the elevator. It wastes electricity. It's not good for the environment. Signs were up for a week. No effect. So what these researchers did, they're very creative. They thought, okay, let's put a little friction on that elevator use. So they made the elevator door close more slowly, 16 seconds slower. And that cut elevator use by a third, which is tremendous. That's exactly what they were trying to do. And, you know, if you'd asked me, I would have said, well, that wouldn't make any difference. If people want to take the elevator, they're going to go in there and they're just going to wait. But they learned very quickly that it wasn't convenient and there were stairs right there. So why not just, it's easier to take the stairs. You'll get there faster. And the lovely thing about the study is they kept the elevator doors slow for a month. And then at the end of the month, they put them back to their regular speed. And people kept taking the stairs. Because in that month, they practiced taking the stairs so much it had become their habit. And it now seemed like the right thing to do and the proper and the easier thing to do, so they just did it. And that's a lovely illustration of how you can change people's behavior through friction in ways that just isn't easy to do by convincing people or by trying to motivate them. Focusing on the behavior directly is what is really important in habit change.
You mentioned the importance of friction again here, and being focused on behavior first, but what also organization can do regarding their product and services. Do you have any advice for them to help their consumers, their client, to adopt eco-friendly habits because of the product and services which are offered by the organization and the companies?
Well, they can make those products and services low friction.
Mhm.
When they are, so we're seeing this a little bit in transportation in the US. The cities, towns, municipalities are going to biking and bike shares. Bike shares make it easy for people to get a bike and just leave it somewhere. They are reducing parking spaces, so it's harder to drive into the city. And they're setting up congestion pricing and other sorts of ways of making it clear to people that there's a charge, that there's friction on that behavior. So that's one example, is adding friction. But there's another one, a second one, that is equally important in forming habits, and that's rewards.
Mm.
People form habits when they repeat behavior, and we've talked a lot about friction. People repeat behavior when it's easy, low friction. People also repeat behavior, though, when it's rewarding. And this is one way that companies, industries, can really help people change their behavior, is to make the new, more eco-friendly products more rewarding. I did a survey for the Paper and Packaging Board, as I said, in the US, and we asked people, would you be willing to spend more for a sustainable package that you could display out front, so when it was delivered, people would see you are concerned about the environment. You're concerned enough to have purchased a special package that can easily be recycled. And consumers said yes, that they would spend extra money just to feel good about what they are purchasing, and maybe to display it off to their neighbors too. So that kind of reward is very important for consumers as well. We've seen Procter & Gamble introduce recently in the US, maybe it's already been in Europe for a while, bars of cleaning products, shampoo, soaps, other things that don't come in plastic containers. And that's another chance for people to feel good. Mm-hmm. So green marketing is great as a way of adding to people's good feelings about using sustainable products. And rewards are very important for forming habits.
I remember in your book, I think you mentioned the idea of intrinsic reward, a link to the habit and the behavior itself.
Exactly. Intrinsic rewards are really good for building habits. Intrinsic rewards are ones that are part of the experience themselves, because habits build most directly when you experience the reward as you're performing the behavior. Giving yourself a reward way in the future isn't going to form a habit. It's not going to get you to repeat the behavior, and you're not going to see the release of dopamine, which is a neurochemical that our brains release when we get a reward, and that helps us to build habits. So that dopamine release when you perform a behavior is really important to forming new habits. So you want to feel good while you're doing it, right when you're doing it. And intrinsic rewards are good for that. But extrinsic rewards that also occur right when you're doing the behavior, they can be helpful too.
Maybe one other question, since the release of your book that Eric mentioned before, Good Habits, Bad Habits. What have you learned? And what are the subjects, the topics you are working on currently?
Well, it underscored right in the book. Let me say first off that I wrote the book because there's a lot of speculation out there on what habits are and how they work. And I wasn't seeing the science out there being explained to people. Instead, you see a lot of, a lot of people's pseudo explanations that I can come up with for how habits work. Habits, because they're this unusual memory system, we don't have direct access to them. So we can't introspect about them in the same way that we don't know our habits in the same way that we know what we think and what we feel and our emotions. So it's not easy to figure out what they are.
Yeah.
And that's why I wrote the book, is I wanted to share all the science with people so that we could more accurately, we could do a better job of changing our behavior. And in writing the book, it made me even more convinced of how much of our behavior is really relevant to habit. That this underlies so much of what we do. So in recent years, I've started talking with HR groups about the challenges of having employees work from home and now have to embrace some hybrid model, or else in some organizations go back to the office completely, and what that does to their habits and how to try to smooth that disruption that all of us experience and how to understand it. Why is that so hard? You're just working, you're just taking your job one place to another. Why would that be disruptive? But it is. So I started talking with HR groups about that. I also work on habits in social media because social media forms certain types of habits, and they're not necessarily ones that are good for us or good for politics or social relations in general. So we've started actually designing new social media interaction platforms that form beneficial habits, that encourage people to share true information, that encourage people to be pro-social instead of just do this kind of harmful social comparison. So we've gotten into social media some too. And I also work with the CDC on health habits, because so many of our health challenges right now are lifestyle challenges. And so health really needs to focus on prevention, needs to focus on lifestyle change. And we've been working with the CDC on particularly issues of diabetes. Type 2 diabetes is a lifestyle disease in large part and can be controlled through changing lifestyle for most of the time. So we've been doing a lot of different work on habits in very different areas, and it's been great fun. I love doing these kinds of talks. I really enjoy working with organizations, and I've even started my own consulting business, working with organizations on their own habit challenges and how to address them. So I think you're doing a wonderful service, Eric, and I'm really appreciative of being involved.
That's great. Wonderful topics. I love what you have shared about the power of habits and also your new topics. Maybe a last question before we start our roundtable. What advice would you give to Chief Sustainability Officer to be more efficient and to accelerate the desired change for the planet?
Well, we've already, to put it in a positive framing, we've already done a great job educating people on the need for change. The next thing to do is figure out how to help them change. And that, going back to what I've said this whole session, you need to focus on the behaviors. You need to know what the behaviors are that you're trying to increase, which ones you're trying to decrease, and then use friction and rewards, which work directly on the behavior itself to influence performance and influence the habits that people form.
Okay, that's a wonderful advice. Thanks a lot for this amazing conversation, Wendy.
Yes, it was a wonderful conversation, I think, and I'm sure a lot among you have enjoyed it. I know that Adrien has enjoyed it because Wendy is really his preferred academic researcher. He is a big fan of Wendy. Now we are going to start our remote roundtable with Sasha Old-Jones, who is innovation consultant at Southern Water, with Canal Pan, who is senior advisor responsible investment at BNP Paribas, and with Richard Wright, who is the director of sustainable behavior at Unilever.
So I think you've gotten used to the drill by now. This is a 30-minute roundtable discussion that'll be structured and led by our colleague Richard Bordenev, who's the CEO of BVA Nudge Consulting Asia Pacific, based in Singapore, and I can see Richard's online already. And after that, there will be 10 minutes of question and answer. So do put your questions into the chat. They'll be fed to Richard, and he will ask them of our panelists. So enjoy the roundtable on sustainability. Thanks.
Thank you, Ted. Thank you, Eric. I'm very glad to have you all for this sustainability roundtable. And we will travel around the world because this one is remote. We will move from UK to Africa, Southeast Asia, ending up in Singapore, where we are, and where actually sustainability is high in the agenda here. So we will start with the first speaker, Sasha. So Sasha Old-Jones, you are actually leading an internal innovation team using human-centered methods and behavioral science at Southern Water, a utility company. So my first question is, we know that water is a resource that is facing multiple challenges around the world. Can you give us a sense of the challenges that your business is facing, and particularly in southeast of England?
Hi, good morning, everyone. Thank you, Richard, and hopefully you can hear me all okay. So yeah, as Richard, as you said, I'm innovation lead at Southern Water, which is a sort of water and wastewater provider for a large part of the southeast of England. So again, we have about 4.6 million customers within the southeast. So one of our really key challenges is ensuring we have a sort of consistent, sustainable supply of clean water, both now, but also crucially in the future. So water scarcity is a really global issue, but I think most people are really unaware that actually it affects us in the UK, and particularly within the southeast of England where we operate. So the southeast of England is actually categorised as an area of serious water stress. So that means that demand for water could actually soon outstrip supply. And this is due to a number of factors. So crucially, climate change, population growth. We have a lot of development and infrastructure going on in the southeast at the moment. Again, sort of changes in behaviour too. So people are using a lot less water than they used to. It's become really ingrained in their habits. But also ageing infrastructure and protected water sources. So the amount that we can actually extract from our local environment. So really our key aim is actually how can we encourage customers to adopt those sustainable behaviours around water use long term. So in order to avoid wastage, but also reducing that consumption long term. And so there are a number of sort of tech solutions that can help to do that, and we're investing in some really exciting technology. But actually, the majority of our success is going to rely on that customer behaviour change. And there are a number of really key challenges with this. So our programme of work that I'm very heavily involved in is HAC22-100. So that's our industry-leading programme, which sets our ambition to reduce customer water consumption to 100 litres per customer per day. So 100 litres probably sounds like quite a lot of water, but actually it's really not. And I think that leads me on to probably one of the biggest challenges that we face, definitely as a company, but also as a sector.
So in terms of a behavioral challenge, like it's kind of new. You mentioned when we had a formal discussion that you are looking at your end customer. So can you share with us like some of the discoveries you've made, like understanding the behavior and maybe the barriers to the behavior change you're trying to achieve?
Yeah, definitely. So I think I can kind of highlight three of our sort of key challenges. The first is a real lack of awareness. So there's something called the Great British Rain Paradox. And this is the view that the UK is a very wet and rainy country, and there just can't possibly be any issues with our water supply. You know, it rains all the time, you know, we can't possibly be running out. But actually a nationwide survey recently of around 2,000 British adults found that actually 77% believe this. They believe it's a wet and rainy country, there's got to be ample water supply. So there's that real lack of awareness of water scarcity itself. But I think maybe more interestingly is that actual underestimation of our own water usage. Water is really, really hidden. And a lot of customers, they only really perceive the amount that they can physically see as water they're using. So actually spoke to a customer recently who, you know, we told him his amount of water usage, and actually he was quite low, and he said, I just don't understand, you know, I have 1 cup of tea, I have, you know, a bottle of water, and he just could not physically understand that actually all the things that, you know, he just didn't consciously understand. So he had a pond, you know, he pressure washed the driveway on occasion. So all of these things that really ramp up our water use that we don't necessarily consciously, you know, observe every day. So that lack of awareness is a real challenge. And then secondly, we also have a real kind of lack of engagement. So again, I mentioned water is very sort of hidden as a behaviour. For a lot of people, it's not a very interesting topic. I mean, it certainly wasn't for me before I came into the sector. So a lot of customers kind of just want to know, you know, I just want to turn my tap on and it's there. I don't want to know the ins and outs of it. You know, just have it work for me. So actually getting customers to really engage with it is one of our biggest challenges. And water use at the moment, because it's not very known about, it's quite low down on the sort of list of, you know, current environmental concerns by the public. And also water is cheap. So I know in the keynote this morning, we talked about, you know, the massive hike in energy prices in the UK. Water customers don't necessarily have the same financial incentives, that their bill won't increase in the same way. So actually trying to find the other ways to incentivize customers is a really interesting sort of focus for us. And then finally, I think most interestingly for me, particularly as a sort of behavioural scientist, is the behavioural biases that are at play. So I can list a kind of few examples that we've really identified. The first is a bit of a kind of better than average effect. So the idea that the majority of people just assume their behaviour is either average or better than average. They assume they're being really, really water efficient. So that means they don't need to change their behaviour, right? You know, they're kind of doing all the right things. But actually, like I said, the behaviour is really unconscious. So we really need to increase that salience to try and help customers understand how much water they're actually using day in, day out. We can make use of social norms, but I think, as I mentioned, we don't see our peers using water. It's a very private act, so it's really hard to make that comparison. There's also kind of short-term thinking and hyperbolic discounting, which is favouring those shorter-term rewards over those kind of longer-term gains. So how do we get people to be motivated to act in a certain way now when they might not see the impact of that behaviour kind of longer term? You know, we're saying we need to protect our rivers and our environment, but actually, you know, you might come home in the freezing cold and just want a bath. And how do you make customers understand to kind of forgo those shorter term sort of goals for the longer term aims? And I think finally, and this is something that I know Wendy mentioned in the keynote, there's a real intention action gap. Most of our customers really want to do the right thing, but actually identifying the right motivation to act is really, really challenging. So I think, again, it's busting that assumption that just because people think they know what to do, that behaviour change will follow. And I think we know it's really not that simple. So yeah, we have a lot of key challenges with our program to face.
Yeah, I think you have a great program, because low motivation, or at least a known problem plus effort without reward is kind of a pretty challenging behavioral challenge to tackle. Actually, how you also mentioned that this is also something that the whole company is trying to address. So it's not just a matter of changing the behaviors of consumers, but also maybe changing the way to address your end customers. So you mentioned it's sort of a cultural shift by just the fact of having you and having a team dedicated to that. Can you elaborate a bit on what is it that a utility company decides to invest in understanding their end customers?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think for our Target 100 program, I think the kind of human-centered side of things that our team bring, particularly in implementing behavioral science, was particularly in this way and at this scale that we are going at the moment, was very new. And I think one of the key ways we did that was we pretty much laid all our cards out on the table at the start, and we just got everybody together, all of our sort of key colleagues, our partners, stakeholders, just in the same room. For sort of a 3-day design sprint. And I think it sounds really obvious to just get people in the room, but actually when people are busy, it's really hard to get everyone together and get them really focused, without laptops, without email, without any distractions, on just solving this challenge and understanding what have we done before, what's worked, what hasn't, what haven't we sort of looked at doing, and what's the untapped sort of potential. So it was really about taking stock of all the sort of past work and the future opportunities. And I think a really key part of that was actually calling out our assumptions that we had about our customers, that we think we know very well. And I think when you work in a sector that, particularly like water, people are very passionate, but we forget that not everybody has the same knowledge and passion that we do. And so I think it's really understanding actually what do our customers know, what incentivizes them, what motivates them. So I think creating a bit of a safe space to talk about, past failings as well was really valuable in that. And I think crucially, we brought in the right expertise in behavioural science. So we worked together to produce a list of our key levers that we knew we could implement to help change customer behaviour. And I think crucially, we looked outside of our sector to do that. So kind of making those comparisons. And we developed a long list of interventions to prioritise. And following on from that, we developed a bit of an innovation test bed. So actually, how can we test interventions really quickly, learn if they work, learn if they don't, that kind of fail fast mentality, before we scaled them out to customers. So we had a kind of safe sort of sandbox to do that within. So kind of want to share a few sort of key examples of some of the levers that we're testing. So we're testing sort of real-time feedback around smart metering. So smart metering technology is something we're investing in, but actually you really need to understand the psychology of that to know how do you get the most out of that. So it's not just providing that feedback to customers with that smarter data. It's actually how do you make it timely and specific and all the things that we kind of know about from the literature. How do you really engage with customers? Also, we've learned a lot about reciprocity. So we've got to practice what we preach as a company. Customers will not change their behaviour if we don't show what we are doing to fix leaks, to optimise our sites, to make sure that we as staff are being as water efficient as possible. We're also framing our messages in particular ways. So we're looking at different segments of customers, so community messaging, but also maybe for us more older demographics, future generations messaging. So how can you help the environment for your future generations, for your grandchildren, for example? And I think finally, habit changing. So again, something that I listened to Wendy mentioning it in the keynote at the start. It's really difficult to change habits, particularly ones that are very unconscious and people don't engage with. But what we do know is that there are times when we're more amenable to changing behaviour. So we can identify those sort of key life stages that lead to those habit changes. So when our customers move home, when our customers start university, for example, we can make a real sort of targeted focus towards those groups. So just a couple of examples of what we're working on, but it's really immersing ourselves in those levers and using all the best practice examples that we can.
Well, thank you very much for all these very tangible examples. I'm sure now we can move to another geography with Richard, because we are leaving UK, not really because you're based in UK, but you've worked in many different regions. Richard is actually Sustainable Behavior Director at Unilever, and he's traveled the world to manage social projects in Africa, South Asia, in partnership with the UK government. So Richard, when we discussed, I discovered that your approach to behavior change is kind of pretty unique. I would say systemic, because you're trying to combine social, environmental, and economic goals. So I'd like to expand with you, like what is it that you're doing with using, for example, the markets? And can you explain some of the examples of the Transform initiative that you had mentioned to me?
Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, all. Yeah, I'm based in the UK, but most of my my work is in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. So my major part of my program is called Transform. It's a public-private partnership between Unilever, the UK government, and also EY, and we have many other partners as well. What we do is we support social businesses in low and middle income countries. We support them because we believe that a lot of the behavior change that's happening is out there in the markets. There's less about the mass communication, the TV advertising. It's about how businesses meet people's everyday needs. So if you say, well, actually, what we need to do, and actually the challenges facing the world are dramatic, and some take your breath away. But if we're trying to drive social, environmental, economic change, it's about business innovation. It's about new products and services, about digitization in these countries. It's a huge opportunity to change behavior. They're young countries. There are people, and I think Sasha was talking about finding those situations where people change their behavior. But when you're poor and you're young, you're much more likely to change your behavior. So it's a very rich territory for behavior change. Having said that, it's largely unsupported by theory. And I think we see a lot of this kind of business model innovation in markets, new products and services, new digitization, and little attempts or few attempts to actually bring the sorts of kind of rigorous behavioral science thinking. So my job is essentially to see how can we use behavior science in these rather complex situations. They're kind of dirty, messy, they're not actually amenable to a lot of the scientific methodologies we do, but they really need our help.
Can you give us some examples of behavior change in the projects you've managed?
So I guess that one of the things which is to highlight is why should Unilever care? Well, we care because actually we sell our products through the small shopkeeper. If we can help them to improve their business, if we can improve the demand for hand washing soap so people wash their hands more, we can improve their hygiene, and we can improve the market dynamics. We can improve the life of the shopkeeper, and also we can provide health and well-being. To give you a tangible example of how this might work, because that's a rather simplistic view, I take you to I think one of our good examples is it was a company called Clean Team. Clean Team were a sanitation business in Kumasi in Ghana. And what they did is they essentially rented toilets to people. They were small toilets, but actually they weren't plumbed, but they needed to be emptied 2 or 3 times a week. But the people in fairly low-income communities in Kumasi now had access to a toilet. Rather than going to public toilets, they had access to the toilet in their own homes. It was obviously going to earning money for the people working for Clean Team, so there was economic value. But actually, one of the things we found out is it had great impacts on the household. So no longer did women have to go to the public toilet at night and cause themselves put themselves at risk. They weren't exposed to some of the pathogens in the public toilets. Children started defecating earlier in life in the toilet, which meant that actually there were less fecal matter around the house. There were lots of hygiene benefits, but one of the key ones that we found was that once you've got your own toilet, you start keeping soap by your own toilet. This made it, we believe, about 75% more likely to wash your hands after defecation. This is compared to a mass communication campaign where you expect probably 10 to 15% uplift if you go on a national level. So you can see you had economic, you also have very much social and health benefits for that. there are multiple behavior changes. And this is one of the things that we try to drive, is that actually a lot of the things that we do within behavioral science are very focused around specific behaviors, but actually there can be lots of collateral benefits on behavior change for business innovation.
So there's a lot about changing the economic behavior as well as the hygiene behavior. So it's all interrelated. When we had the conversation earlier on, I asked you what is the biggest challenge that you see in like developing this kind of system innovation, and you mentioned to me universalism. I was quite surprised, and I thought it would be really something to discuss today, because I assume you've experienced the hard way how culture is a key ingredient to behavioral change. So can you tell us more about this?
Well, I'm proud of some of my failures, or maybe not so proud, but I to learn from failures. I think what I've found out over probably 20 years working in these countries is that actually there is a major challenge of universalism. Universalism, I always think it's borne out by people who are a bit like me. Okay, so when we're inspired to think about behavior change, we start with ourselves as a model, and we realize that actually people are a little bit different to us. There's different cultures, there's different interests, but actually we fail to appreciate the difference. And this particularly, I found that kind of goes when you take Western innovation that's very successful in the States, particularly kind of say the west coast of the States, where there's a lot of digital innovation, and also Europe. And we try and actually land these innovations within Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia. And we take very much a kind of a rich Western individualistic cultural understanding into rather poor global South collectivist communities. And they don't land. They don't land so well. So I think there is a real challenge in terms of rolling out. I always say sometimes designed in London, maybe you could say designed in San Francisco. But actually a lot of what we try to do is to try and think about how these technologies are appropriated in these communities. And I describe myself as the Mzungu. Okay, a Mzungu is a white person in Swahili. And it actually means somebody who's lost. And I go in as a Mzungu. I'm always the Mzungu. It's actually, and my belief is that actually my first job is to understand how, or start to understand how these technologies might land.
Do you have some examples of misfit or gaps that you had to close?
Oh, lots, yes. It's where to start. So I think we've seen in rural Kenya and also in lots of Zambia is the failure to embrace digital technologies. So public Wi-Fi in rural Kenya was not adopted because actually that the habit of browsing and high-speed internet was not something that they wanted to do. Also, there's a risk of basically going on the internet because you have to pay money, and when you pay your own money and there's not very much of it, it's a huge risk to actually buy more data. I think actually I'll give you one of my favorite anecdotes, which I share with lots of people, is we were in rural Bangladesh and we were creating a little app for pharmacists, and this was to track the people they'd lent money to. So there's a big habit of actually lending money out and providing credit to your poor customers, otherwise they can't afford your product at the end of the month when they haven't been paid. And I was trying to say, well, we could give you a little app on your smartphone and that could track your payments and your credit. And the guy, to cut a longer story short, would only use a book. And I said, well, why do you use a book? He goes, because at the end of the year, I close the book, I write out the debts, and invite everybody round to a party. And my realization was actually the app was based on an economic business decision, but actually the book and the loans were about his status in the community and about how he interacted with the community. It was part of his gift to the community. Now you can see the mismatch between the kind of the Western hard-nosed business decision versus how he related to his community. And the context of how you do innovation is hugely important. You know.
Fabulous. Thank you very much for sharing. I think we're going to move to Southeast Asia now with Singapore, with Canal. And we'll come back to some of the topics that have been discussed. And you can also, each of you, ask questions to each other. But first, Canal is actually upstream in the innovation value chain because he's there to support sustainable investment. So Canal, you're a specialist of sustainable investment at BNP Paribas Singapore. That means you define the asset classes for investors to choose from. And although you're quite new to the field of behavioral science, you've recently embarked on a journey with to nudge client advisor to encourage more sustainable investment. So can you just give us a word of what it means to promote sustainable investment as a behavior for a bank? For BNP Paribas.
Hi, Chad, thanks. I hope that you can hear me well.
Yes.
Just a quick description of what we do. So BNP Paribas, we have been a leader in sustainable finance and investment since 2007. Sustainability is one of the three pillars of our strategy. Our strategy is about growth, technology, and sustainability. So like our CEO used to say, we cannot win in a world that loses. So we have to take into account the environmental and the social challenges. So we are also one of the first signatories of the Net Zero Banking Alliance, which commit us to align our loan portfolios to be able to finance a net zero green economy. Myself, I work in the wealth management business line, and our corporate purpose is to help clients make a positive environmental and social impact. So who are our clients? Our clients are high net worth individuals, family offices, so across from the old generation to the millennials. We have entrepreneurs as well. But we also have internal clients who are our private bankers, our investment advisors. And within that context, sustainable investment they need to take into account the financial return. Actually, they also have a very short-term horizon. And what we notice is that awareness in sustainable investing has been increasing very fast in Asia, but yet there is a kind of a gap between intention and action.
Yeah, we've seen that 80% of investors say that environmental or ethical issues are central in managing their investment, but actually less than a quarter actually invest in ESG products. So through your experience now with the interviewing the clients and understanding the reasons behind, can you share with us, like, why is this gap happening?
Yes, so this gap is happening because there's still a lot of misconception and wrong belief. I think I can quote three of them. The first one is about the understanding of what is sustainable investment. So it's about sacrificing returns. So they always believe that investing sustainability is about sacrificing return. Some of them also believe that it's philanthropy, so no financial return. And I think that the third one, important one, is about greenwashing. I mean, people are concerned about greenwashing. So they are very cautious about really putting their money in sustainable funds. So what we have done is that we started a nudge project to try to understand the psychological drivers at play, to see how we can reduce the barriers, find solution, and increase motivation. So in form, and then we, as you mentioned, we interview clients and also private bankers to understand what are the behavioral biases that are.
Do you have some examples to give us?
Yes, I mean, there are various behavioral bias, but let me focus on the most important one. I think the first one is the loss aversion. So it's related to investment, right? So there's no much experience from the client side that investing sustainability means also performing well or outperforming the traditional investment. So that's the first one. The second one, I would say it's more like the cognitive overload. I mean, what is SRI? What is ESG? You know, in that industry, there are so many acronyms, so many taxonomies, so many perception of what is sustainable investment. The third one, and I would say that's probably one of the most important one, is the status quo bias. I mean, people are so used to look at investment only from the financial lens, but not really from the environmental and social lens. So this is something that we need them to change. And the last one, I would say it's also abstract, because what is the link between climate change and investment? You know, it's quite difficult for people to understand that.
So I see that habits is there, and business as usual is probably one of the reasons of the status quo. But you've started some initiatives, and you've tried to mitigate some of these biases. Can you share some of the actions you've put in place and thoughts on how to mitigate this?
Sure. So I guess that if you listen to Wendy Wood, we try to frame it in the habit framework. So the first one is how to change old habits. And one of the things that we do is to increase friction on the old habit. So for BNP Paribas, we have an exclusion list. So all companies in the tobacco sector, in the unconventional oil sector and all that, they are really excluded from our investment recommendation. We also have a sector policy, so we have a monitoring list of all the companies that are not really behaving so much sustainability. So all these companies actually do not form part of our investment universe. I think I remember when we just said that we try to change the habit by changing the environment. And what we do actually, our investment recommendation is very much biased towards much more sustainable companies. The second action item is about how to form new habits. And this is really the focus of action. And I would say that the first one is that we need to repeat all the time, because habits cannot just be formed in 1 week, 1 month, or 3 months. So we do a lot of communication and training. We do a lot of quiz, newsletter, and all that. And also what is important is that the client now needs something like a bite-sized information. I think there's no point in giving them tons of research, many pages of research. It's very difficult to do that. We also do the peer-to-peer sharing. So any private bankers who have been successful with clients come and share. So that's on a monthly basis that we do that. So these are some of the examples that we do. It's about repeating often. The second one is about the rewards and incentive. So we also run campaign of who is the team that is managed to promote more sustainable investment. And the winning team got to donate some money to charities and all that of their choice. And we are working right now also on setting KPIs, which is about financial rewards and all that linked to their performance. But I would say that financial rewards is not enough. So we need to make it enjoyable as well. So we organize team building exercises and all that, where we don't really talk so much about investment, but let's say it's a lot of games. We are planning right now to have some game to learn about climate with Climate Fresh. So it's just learning through gamification. So this is one thing that we have been doing. We are also celebrating success. So those who are successful need to get to share and all that as well. Yeah. So these are some of the examples that we have put in place.
Thank you very much, Chanel. That's very tangible, and it's also a way to show that we call nudge sometimes things that are just about reorganizing existing assets that you have internally. Like it's about marketing, training, and couple of elements of information that are just reshaped, reframed to actually drive behavior change because they are meeting either the habit loop or the expectations of your users. So I think we are now good for the roundtable, and I will launch a few questions. We have quite a few in the chat. I'll start with the first one, which is about there's been a question on some companies are creating some internal innovation teams. Some have none. So if you were to give us a tip on where to start for a company who is actually just at the beginning of the journey, what would be your advice? Like how to start the journey with behavioral science when we don't yet have a full team available to carry on experiments? Who would like to take this one?
I mean, I can start if you want, Richard. So, our objective is not really to build a very big sustainability team, but really to empower each one of our product specialists, each one of our private bankers, investment advisors to understand what is the sustainability and all that. So we have a kind of form a team like the SRI ambassadors. So I guess that the social norms in terms of behavioral science is very important. So for them really to show the other colleagues also what it means that to invest on a sustainability basis. So the idea for us actually is to build a sustainability culture among the firm, not to have just a very big department in terms of sustainability. Actually, we are only just two of us actually, but we try to get a lot of people in.
Sasha, maybe you can share how you've built your team and created some enthusiasm around.
Yeah, I think kind of creating an environment outside of BAU is really, really valuable. And I think that's for all levels of an organization. So I think creating a space where it's okay to try things and fail. And I think just having a team that are really sort of curious and tenacious, I think, and the key, I think, particularly for embedding behavioral science is really start small. You don't have to have the answer to absolutely everything. You don't have to have the solution that will work for every kind of customer segment or, every kind of solution, but actually just start small, try things out, sort of test, learn, test again, I think is generally the way that we work at Blue Wave.
Great. And another question I see in the chat, a bit more challenging, this one. Some companies have actually used the plastic and packaging to offer like more affordable products and more like usable formats for some countries, but it's actually going against the idea of sustainability. So how do we solve the challenge of making it easy for users and affordable on a price point, and on the other side sustainable, because then it generates some externalities? So who would like to take this one?
Well, I'd take that one. It sounds like one for me, actually.
Probably.
I think they're probably more than a water company and a financial company. They're thinking about a packaged goods company. So I think the previous speaker talked about package reduction, and that's absolutely right. Certainly refill models, which are challenging to work from a behavior change point of view, and also from hygiene and there were all sorts of challenges, but there's a huge behavior change job to do, as well as an innovation job. I think what we're looking at, and we work on a number of different projects looking at circular economy, the idea that you can kind of you can reclaim or reduce, reuse or recycle plastics, is you need to not only innovate with the packaging, but you need to innovate around the behavior change. So this is two aspects of it. You've got to get people to care. I think actually thinking about the other two speakers as well, is that actually you need to care about water, and you need to care about financial decisions around the environment, and actually getting people to care about plastic packaging and where it goes is hugely important, not just and then you've got to think about collection as well, models. So they need to actually, people need to adopt different approaches to actually plastic packaging, and we need to actually ensure that actually it's collected. I think Unilever's held its hands up and said that we have huge targets around this, and it's a breathtakingly difficult behaviour change programme. But I do agree with the sentiment behind the question as well.
Thank you. Just looking at the chat, some other questions are more technical, maybe. Oh yes, there is one about when you nudge clients and colleagues to consider risk management aspects of ESG investing, are you also nudging them on understanding the risks, like not just the opportunities? Like how do you combine the idea of encouraging a certain type of investment with also making people confident, or at least aware of the risk they are taking?
Yes, okay, I mean, that's a good question. Of course, we do both risk and opportunities as well. So obviously, when this kind of trend or sustainable investment have started, a lot of people are focusing on risk. So as I mentioned to you, in terms of risk, we stopped recommending all these companies in sector like thermal coal, like tobacco, like unconventional shale and gas. And all these are not within our recommendation. So if the client wants to invest, he has to do the research by himself. So in fact, it's just a kind of manage the risk from that side as well. And opportunities, of course, I mean, with the progress of the green economy, new technology and all that, I mean, there's a lot of new opportunities actually for them to invest. So we have shifted actually from the risk to the opportunity side. But we also have a system to be able to assess a company, the degree of sustainability of a company, so broken down by the environment, the social and the governance. And sometimes you might think that a company is very good in environmental side, but on the governance side is bad. So it's kind of, lower down the score for that company. So we do have that system to kind of educate the client and to show the client what is really what is happening there behind each company.
Thank you very much, Kanal. I think we are now reaching the end of this roundtable. I'd like to thank all of our speakers. You've been great, and really there was a lot of new things from before the conversations we had previously. I'd like also to thank the organizers and the people in Singapore. There's a Behavioral Science Network. A couple of people have gathered in a restaurant and they are watching us, so they were supporting. So the whole behavioral science community is there behind us. I say hello, and I'm going to join them, and I leave the floor to Ted. Thank you again. Bye-bye.